Iran and Israel don't share a single mile of border. They have no direct colonial past linking them together. Yet today, they're locked in an open conflict that has the entire world watching. For years, these two nations engaged in something darker than traditional warfare. Shadow operations, proxy battles fought through other groups, targeted killings, cyber warfare that never made headlines. Everyone knew this dance couldn't last forever. What almost nobody expected was how rapidly the music would stop. To really grasp where this conflict came from, you need to rewind the clock more than 100 years. Back to when empires were collapsing, nations were being born, and a single revolution would flip everything upside down. The early 1900s looked drastically different in the Middle East. One massive power controlled nearly everything. The Ottoman Empire had dominated this region for 6 centuries, ruling over vast territories with an iron grip. But empires don't last forever. By the turn of the 20th century, cracks were everywhere. Military losses piled up. Corruption ate away at the government from within. Rebellions kept erupting across different provinces. Britain and France watched from the sidelines, waiting for their moment to swoop in and claim the pieces. World War I gave them that chance. The Ottomans made a fatal bet by siding with Germany. When Germany fell in 1918, the Ottoman Empire went down with it. What happened next would plant seeds that are still growing today. Britain and France carved up the Middle East like they were dividing a cake. New borders appeared on maps, lines drawn by people who'd never set foot in these lands. Ethnic groups were split. Religious communities were separated. Tribal territories were sliced apart. Nobody asked the people living there what they wanted. Britain grabbed control of a chunk of land they called Mandatory Palestine. This narrow strip along the eastern Mediterranean coast was home to mostly Arab Muslims, some Arab Christians, and a small but growing Jewish population. This is where our story really begins. Jewish communities across Europe had suffered centuries of persecution, violent attacks in Russia, systematic discrimination everywhere else. By the late 1800s, a movement emerged with a powerful vision. Zionism argued that Jewish people needed their own homeland, a place where they'd finally be safe from persecution. That place, they believed, should be Palestine, the ancient homeland described in Jewish scripture. Britain made a habit of promising everything to everyone during the war. They told Arab leaders they'd support independence if Arabs rebelled against Ottoman rule. They told Jewish leaders through the Balfour Declaration in 1917 that they'd back a Jewish homeland in Palestine. These promises contradicted each other completely. Britain knew it. Jewish immigration to Palestine surged through the 20s and 30s. As Hitler rose to power in Europe and persecution intensified, more Jewish families fled to Palestine seeking safety. Arab Palestinians watched their homeland's demographics shift dramatically. Fear turned to anger. Anger turned to violence. Britain found itself trapped between two groups with claims to the same land that simply couldn't be reconciled. Then came the Holocaust. 6 million Jewish people systematically murdered by Nazi Germany. The world reacted with horror. Support for a Jewish homeland reached levels that couldn't be ignored anymore. Britain, exhausted and broken after World War II, handed the entire problem to the brand new United Nations and walked away. May 14th, 1948. Israel declared independence. Within hours, the United States recognized the new nation. The Soviet Union followed quickly. 5 Arab armies responded the very next day by invading with one clear goal: destroy this nation before it could establish itself. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon all sent forces. Every military analyst predicted Israel wouldn't survive. They were wrong. Israel not only survived, it expanded, ending up with more territory than the UN partition plan had originally assigned. Israelis called it their War of Independence, a miraculous fulfillment of a 2,000-year dream. Palestinians called it the Nakba, the catastrophe. Over 700,000 Palestinian Arabs either fled or were forced from their homes. Entire villages vanished. A refugee crisis began that still hasn't been resolved 75 years later. So where was Iran during all this? In 1948, Iran was a constitutional monarchy led by a Shah, a Persian king. Iran wasn't Arab, it was Persian. It had no direct stake in the Palestinian struggle the way neighboring Arab countries did. Here's what most people don't know. Iran under the Shah actually maintained relatively normal relations with Israel. The two countries even cooperated on intelligence sharing and military matters. Which raises an obvious question. How did Iran transform from a quiet neighbor into Israel's most dangerous adversary? The answer involves one of the 20th century's most dramatic political earthquakes. But understanding that transformation requires understanding what happened to Iran itself first. Because the Iran that exists today is fundamentally different from the Iran that existed when Israel was founded. The government changed, the ideology changed, the entire national identity changed, and that change didn't happen peacefully. What comes next explains everything about why these two nations are where they are today. Through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, Iran's Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi positioned himself as a modernizer. He championed Western-style education, pushed for women's participation in public life, redistributed land from wealthy landlords, and drove rapid industrialization. Washington loved him. He was fiercely anti-communist and deeply pro-American. But his authority rested on shakier ground than appearances suggested. 1951 brought a seismic shift. Iran's parliament elected Mohammad Mossadegh as prime minister. Mossadegh wasn't just popular, he was wildly beloved, a democratic nationalist with one burning objective: reclaim Iran's oil from British control. For decades, Britain had extracted massive wealth from Iranian oil fields, while ordinary Iranians received almost nothing. Mossadegh nationalized the entire industry. Britain's reaction was fury. America's reaction was alarm. August 1953. The Shah, sensing political winds turning hostile, fled Iran completely, first to Iraq, then to Rome. What unfolded next would permanently reshape Middle Eastern geopolitics. The CIA and British intelligence executed a covert operation codenamed Ajax. They hired street thugs to create chaos throughout Tehran. They bribed military officers. They manufactured protests demanding Mossadegh's removal. His government crumbled within days. He was arrested, spending the remainder of his life imprisoned in his own home. The Shah was flown back and reinstalled as ruler, now more indebted to Washington than ever. For America and Britain, mission accomplished. Iranian oil remained accessible. A friendly government stayed in power. For Iranians, something entirely different had occurred. Their democratically chosen leader had been toppled by foreign intelligence agencies protecting foreign corporate interests. The humiliation cut deep. It was never forgiven. The Shah governed with escalating brutality through the 60s and 70s. His secret police, the Savak, became notorious for imprisoning, torturing, and executing dissidents. Political opposition was crushed systematically. But Iran had oil wealth and strategic importance. Washington ignored the abuses. Below the surface, Iranian society simmered with rage. 1979. The pressure valve exploded. Massive protests engulfed Iran. The Shah's regime collapsed. He escaped in January and died in exile months later. Into the resulting void stepped Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, a hardline Shia cleric who'd spent years exiled, preaching revolutionary doctrine that fused Islamic governance with fierce rejection of American and Western interference in Muslim lands. Khomeini's return drew millions into the streets. The Islamic Republic of Iran was proclaimed, a theocracy where religious law and religious figures controlled government. Iran's entire character transformed overnight. The Shah's secular, Western-aligned state became an Islamic revolutionary government, viewing America as the great Satan and Israel as its illegitimate puppet planted in Muslim territory. Israel's Tehran embassy was handed to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Iran shifted from being Israel's discreet partner to its most threatening adversary. Not because geography changed, but because governing ideology did. Then something occurred that made Iran-West relations permanently poisonous. November 1979. Iranian students stormed America's Tehran embassy, seizing 52 American diplomats. They remained captive for 444 days. The hostage crisis obliterated any chance of Iran-America reconciliation for generations. Iran's antagonism toward Israel, America's closest Middle East ally, hardened into unchangeable state doctrine. September 1980. With Iran weakened by revolution and international isolation, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded. The Iran-Iraq war dragged on for 8 merciless years. Over 1 million people perished. Iran fought with revolutionary zeal, but faced superior weaponry and total isolation. America and most Western powers quietly supported Iraq. This war produced 2 critical consequences for the Iran-Israel dynamic. First, it convinced Iran's revolutionary leadership they needed advanced indigenous military capabilities and could never depend on foreign assistance. This thinking eventually propelled Iran's nuclear ambitions. Second, Iran refined its strategy of backing proxy militias throughout the region, forces capable of fighting Iran's battles without Iranian soldiers crossing borders. The most important proxy was Hezbollah, a Shia militant organization established in Lebanon in 1982 with direct Iranian backing. Weapons, training, financing, all flowed from Tehran. Hezbollah's stated mission was resisting Israel. Iran had discovered how to wage war against Israel without launching a single strike from Iranian territory. The proxy doctrine was operational. Throughout the 90s and 2000s, Iran steadily advanced its nuclear program, officially claiming purely civilian energy purposes. Israel and Western governments remained deeply suspicious. A nuclear-armed Iran represented Israel's absolute nightmare scenario. An ideologically hostile regime openly advocating Israel's elimination, possessing nuclear weapons, created an existential threat Israel couldn't accept. Israel's response took multiple forms. Covert sabotage targeted Iranian nuclear facilities and personnel. Multiple Iranian scientists were assassinated in operations widely blamed on Israeli intelligence. The Stuxnet computer worm, believed jointly developed by America and Israel, physically destroyed Iranian nuclear centrifuges from the inside. Iran countered by expanding its proxy network. Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, Houthi forces in Yemen, Iranian-backed militias scattered across Iraq and Syria, a ring of armed groups encircling Israel from every direction, all receiving funds, weapons, and training from Tehran. 2015's Iran nuclear agreement, the JCPOA, briefly offered diplomatic resolution. Iran committed to restricting its nuclear program in exchange for lifted international sanctions. Israel vehemently opposed the agreement, insisting it didn't impose sufficient constraints. 2018 brought President Trump's withdrawal. He argued sunset provisions meant crucial restrictions would simply expire after 10 to 15 years, merely postponing rather than preventing an Iranian bomb. He claimed it ignored Iran's ballistic missile development and lacked rigorous inspection protocols. Here's what made this genuinely contentious. International monitors repeatedly verified Iran's full compliance. Every other agreement participant urged Trump to remain committed. He withdrew regardless. The consequences proved devastating. Iran, deprived of promised sanctions relief, progressively abandoned its commitments and accelerated nuclear enrichment. The world found itself worse off than before negotiations began. Through the 2000s, 20s, and into 2024, Iran and Israel waged what strategists termed a shadow war. Continuous low-intensity conflict executed through targeted killings, digital warfare, aerial bombardments, and proxy forces instead of conventional military engagement. Israel launched hundreds of strikes across Syria, targeting Iranian arms convoys destined for Hezbollah. Iran answered through its network of allied militias. September 2024 witnessed one of history's most brazen intelligence operations. Israeli operatives had invested years establishing a Hungarian shell company manufacturing pages for Hezbollah, covertly embedding explosives in battery compartments. September 17th, thousands detonated simultaneously throughout Lebanon and Syria, killing 42 and wounding over 4,000. The next day, walkie-talkies erupted in a follow-up strike. 1,500 Hezbollah operatives were incapacitated. Security analysts called it Hezbollah's gravest breach ever. Days afterward, Israel struck its most crushing blow. Israeli intelligence had tracked Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's leader for 3 decades and among the Middle East's most formidable militant commanders. They identified his location during a meeting with senior Hezbollah leadership in an underground fortification 60 feet beneath residential towers in Beirut's Dahieh neighborhood. September 27th, the Israeli Air Force attacked. 80 munitions slammed the structure in one synchronized assault. The reinforced bunker, engineered to survive virtually any standard attack, was annihilated. The apartments overhead crumbled into debris. Nasrallah perished alongside multiple Hezbollah commanders and an Iranian Revolutionary Guard general dispatched by Khamenei himself to alert Nasrallah of the danger. Iran's proxy network, constructed across decades at tremendous expense, was being methodically dismantled. The shadow conflict nearly erupted into full-scale war during 2024. April brought Israel's bombing of Iran's consular facility in Damascus, eliminating 2 Iranian generals and 7 additional senior Revolutionary Guard officers. Striking diplomatic premises on foreign territory constituted a major escalation and crossed what many considered an inviolable threshold. Iran responded April 13th with over 300 drones and missiles, marking Iran's inaugural direct assault on Israeli territory. Israel and allied defenses intercepted 99%. October 2024 saw Iran launch a second missile barrage. Iran justified this attack by citing Israel's assassinations of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah in Beirut, and senior Revolutionary Guard commander Abbas Nilfarushan. Understanding this requires acknowledging a critical pattern. Every Iranian strike in 2024 was framed as retaliation for Israeli operations. Whether you accept that reasoning, and numerous observers don't, chronology matters. Neither party in this confrontation possesses moral superiority. Israel counterattacked, obliterating substantial portions of Iran's air defense infrastructure and proving its capacity to penetrate deep into Iranian territory whenever desired. Iran confronted a brutal dilemma: witness its regional architecture completely disintegrate or escalate toward direct warfare. This narrative remains incomplete without October 7th, 2023. Hamas, financed and equipped by Iran, executed the deadliest assault on Jewish civilians since the Holocaust. 1,200 Israelis killed, 250 seized as hostages. Israel's reaction was overwhelming. Ground forces invaded Gaza. By late 2024, over 40,000 Palestinians had died, predominantly women and children, according to Gaza health officials. The United Nations described the humanitarian catastrophe as unprecedented. Increasing numbers of international legal experts employed the term genocide. Israel categorically rejected this characterization. The Gaza conflict intensified everything. It mobilized Iran's proxy apparatus. It radicalized populations throughout the region. It furnished Israel's administration political authorization to target adversaries, Iran included, more forcefully than any previous period in Israeli history. February 28, 2026. The United States and Israel initiated a massive joint military offensive against Iran. Operation Epic Fury. American B-2 stealth bombers demolished Iran's ballistic missile installations, while Israeli aircraft struck objectives across all 31 Iranian provinces. Strategic locations in Tehran were hit, including state broadcasting headquarters and the historic Golistan Palace, a UNESCO World Heritage designation. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed alongside numerous senior commanders and government officials. Civilian casualties have been catastrophic. A joint airstrike demolished a girls' school in southern Iran, killing at least 165 children. Iran retaliated instantly. Coordinated drone and missile barrages targeted sites throughout the Middle East, striking the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. Iran's Revolutionary Guard announced closure of the Strait of Hormuz, among the planet's most vital petroleum shipping corridors. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has cautioned the severest strikes against Iran remain forthcoming. What unfolds next? Nobody possesses answers. Will Iran's regime survive? Will Iranian citizens revolt? Will the Strait of Hormuz stay blockaded, triggering global energy catastrophe? Will this expand into broader regional conflagration? What remains certain is this: everything transpiring now traces back over a century to an empire's dissolution, to commitments issued and violated by colonial authorities, to revolution, to decades of proxy warfare, assassination, and nuclear brinkmanship that brought the world to catastrophe's threshold. Now you understand how two nations without shared borders or colonial entanglement became mortal enemies locked in open war that threatens to reshape the entire Middle East permanently. The borders drawn carelessly decades ago still bleed today. The revolution that promised liberation created new chains. The proxies funded to avoid direct confrontation have drawn their sponsors into exactly what they feared most. This conflict didn't arrive suddenly. It's been building brick by brick, assassination by assassination, red line by red line for generations. Whether you view Iran as defender of resistance or sponsor of terror, whether you see Israel as democratic refuge or occupying force, the truth remains brutally simple. Both nations are trapped in a cycle where neither can afford to lose and neither knows how to win.